It started with a simple idea, I promise, but as these things do, it grew and grew, and now we have the Bentley Collection, created in honor of my friend Ara Bentley of Bentley House Minis. If you're not already following her, do so at once. She's one of the most charming and inventive miniaturists out there. I'll put a link in the description. Ara needed railings for a widow's walk for her Addams family mansion. And if you're not following that project, boy, are you missing out. Run, don't walk over to Bentley House Minis and get caught up on all of the Addams family madness. Anyway, so she needed this railing, and I jumped at the chance to help her out by providing a set of SVG files for her to use. She promptly cut them with her brand new laser cutter, and the results were incredible. Well, once I got started working on this idea of creating a widow's walk for her, I couldn't stop. And so 2 weeks later, here we are, and the Bentley Collection has now arrived. For an opportunity to use some of the new tools available for the Cricut Maker, things like the fine debossing tip, the engraving tip, and the scoring wheels. This project uses all three. A red 1 by 1 inch square has been included in each of the SVG files for this bundle. I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'll select one of the files and bring it into the design space canvas. And you'll notice that there are 2 layers listed underneath the named file. Users of Design Space will have no need of using this 1 by 1 inch square. It's intended as a point of reference for anyone using software other than Cricut Design Space that might need to resize the files. All Design Space users can simply turn off visibility for the red square and then treat the file as they normally would. Here are a few of the die cuts that you'll create if you work with this bundle. There are pieces here for external hardware for either side of the door. This is a wall panel that's scored so that it folds into 3 separate walls. These are brackets for hanging lanterns. And the door consists of sort of 2 stacks that then get layered together. I'm going to dump out those little panels so you can get a better idea of what's going on here. There's a debossed layer underneath that helps you to place those little individual panels once the time is right for that operation. This is 1/2 of the door. There's an identical stack of layers that is used for the other half of the door. So you can tell this is going to be a very sturdy construction. I just love that. Also, these pieces are meant to be layered on both the exterior and the interior of the door. There are enough of them included that you can do a double thickness if you like. I ended up just using 1 layer, but if you like a heavier set of hardware, go ahead and layer them up. And then this little piece we will be manipulating so that it makes a beautifully curved door handle, one for either side. These thin strips get layered onto the front of the exterior door casing, creating interesting shadow lines and building up some of those architectural details. And the debossing tool has been used here, again, to help you determine where those pieces are to be adhered. The door casing itself works together with the 3-part folding wall, and these pieces will eventually all be glued together. Let's begin the process with the 2 interior door panels. You can use any good quality glue for this operation. We're just going to be building up layers and layers of chipboard until we have very solid doors. You'll notice that there's a keyhole that runs all the way through the door panels. Take extra care to line up the edges of the keyhole. And also, these cutouts along the back of the door are intended for the insertion of metal hinges if you choose to use them. Once the pieces have been glued together, I like to reinforce the bond with a brayer. The next layer of chipboard for the door is this one that has all of the debossed lines on it. On top of that will go this framing panel. It's easiest if you add the adhesive to the back of the framing panel. That way you won't get glue over all of the parts that are going to remain exposed. Line everything up and press it firmly into place, making sure that the edges of the keyhole are properly aligned. It's purely optional, but if you choose to, you can add these little tiny cutouts that are sized to fit inside of each of these panels. The debossing lines on the lower level help you to determine where each of the panels should be placed so that they're evenly spaced. A fine pointed pair of tweezers really comes in handy for operations like this. I use them not only to place the panels, but to nudge them and shift them into place while the adhesive is still in a liquid state. Then I brayer everything down so that the bond is very firm. I like to turn the piece over and brayer it from the back as well. Repeat this process for the panels that go on either side of the door. Now we're adding those little architectural details that we talked about earlier. The door casing has all these debossed lines that help us to determine where these little guys should be glued. There are these 2 rectangles that get lined up and layered together, and then they get placed at the base of the door frame. Next, the long, thin strips get placed down the center of each side of the door frame. The last little bit of detailing on the door frame is to add this trapezoid shape to the very upper edge. There are 2 of these strips, and they can be layered one on top of the other for a more prominent shadow line. Now that the door panels have had a chance to set up, it's time to layer them all together. So we have the 2 interior panels with the cutouts for the hinges, and glue is being placed on one side of that construction. Then one of the exterior door panels is being placed on top. And again, everything lined up so that that keyhole stays nice and clear. So now we have a total of 4 layers going on here. Here I'm just doing a quick dry fit to make certain that the hinges that I've chosen for this project are going to fit nicely. And they do. So that's awesome. Okay, moving on. Next, I'm gluing on the escutcheon plate. Again, making sure that that keyhole remains free and clear and that the edges are as close to perfectly aligned as I'm capable of creating. There, that looks pretty good. I like it. At this stage, I'm ready to begin hardening the chipboard. For this, I'm using Star Bond super thin super glue. I love this stuff and it works wonders. It transforms the lightweight, flimsy chipboard into a substance that resembles a miniature hardwood. Yep, it's that good. I love it. But you have to be careful with it, so make sure you have adequate ventilation and that you follow all the safety precautions. Now, before we put both halves of the door panels together, if you're going to be embedding hinges, now's the time to do it. I'm putting a good quality adhesive into these little slots, and then I'll be mounting those metal hinges directly into that bed of adhesive. Once the hinges have been installed, I just verify that everything's lining up correctly, and then apply the opposite panel on the other side, capturing the flanges of the hinges between the two. Before we go any further, I'm going to add the escutcheon plates onto the other side of the door. Now it's time to harden all of the areas of the door, both sides and all of the edges, being very careful though not to get super glue into the hinging mechanism because it will clog it up and make them freeze in place, and we don't want that. Now it's time to create the curved door handle. And for this, I'm simply manipulating the chipboard by grasping it with some needle nose pliers and bending back these two plates at the upper and lower end. And then I will use some round nose pliers to help create a soft curve. A bit of adhesive is added to the bottom of the lower plate, and then it's pressed into place just above the keyhole. The rounding that we've done to the handle should shorten it sufficiently that the upper plate will fit right against the top edge of that escutcheon plate. And now we can harden it with super glue, fixing everything in place. I'll add the corresponding handle on the other side of the door at a later stage in the process. Now that the door has been constructed, it's time to give it a finish. I've chosen to use this cherry red India ink, and I'm going to just slather it all over the surface of the door. One of the reasons that I've chosen to use the ink rather than, say, an enamel or acrylic paint is because it is slightly translucent and it automatically creates variation in the finish, and I just love that look. Also, it's super simple to apply. You can see the richness of color, even though it's translucent, that we get from just one or two coats, and it dries very quickly with the help of a heat tool. Once the initial application of ink has dried thoroughly, I'm coming back in with a dark Van Dyke brown and applying it to all of the crevices on the surface of this richly paneled door. I've thinned black acrylic craft paint with a bit of very thick coffee stain to create sort of a black wash. It's a little heavier than most washes, but it's not as thick as a typical acrylic paint. And that's what we want. A paint might obscure some of the details here. A wash, however, will allow all of those shadow lines to be completely revealed while still tinting the chipboard. This is being applied to the escutcheon plate and also to the handle. I've switched out the fine detail brush for a ratty old glue brush that has sort of splayed bristles at the end of it, and I'm applying this same wash in a weathering pass. I feather the strokes to create the impression of wear and tear and darkness, at the edges of the panels, and especially at the top and the bottom of the door itself. Now I want to add some detailing using this glorious copperplate gold ink. I'm creating tiny dots of gold just to simulate the hardware that would attach this heavy handle to the escutcheon plate on the door. You could as easily perform this same operation with the tip of a toothpick. I'm also adding just the tiniest pinstriping effect to the edge of the handle. Now my hands aren't as steady as I would like them to be, so this is a messier application than I had envisioned. But I still think that it lends an air of opulence to this otherwise sort of clunky looking door handle, helping to give it a feeling of refinement. Once the gold ink has had a chance to set up for a few moments, I come back in with a fine detailed brush and the same black wash that we've used previously. It's difficult to see here, but I'm adding tiny little shadow lines beneath each of those simulated fasteners, and I'm refining that gold stripe down the center of the handle by covering up some of the blotchiness at the edges. This very subtle shadowing layer makes a huge difference in the long run. Now that the handle is in place and has been detailed, I'm adding more shadowing using that same black wash around the escutcheon plate and several of the door panels. To simulate the look of a heavy old varnish, I'll be applying Starbond directly to the painted and inked surface, and then gently wiping across the surface with a piece of paper toweling. Now, I'm not attempting to rub this in. In fact, I want it to remain on the surface in a very shiny but clear layer. Be careful when doing this because the superglue does produce heat as it cures, and you certainly don't want to stick your fingertip to the paper towel. But if you move quickly and pay attention to what you're doing, you can get a very shiny, rich, and durable finish by simply applying the Starbond and wiping it across the surface. There are a couple of ways to approach assembling the door frame area of the little gatehouse. We'll look at one of them now. This is the wall portion, and it's scored to create flaps that get glued to the sides of the other walls. But it also has this area in the center where we apply the built-up door frame that we created earlier. We have these 3 pieces of debossed and cut paper that will be applied to the exterior of the wall panel. I think it's a good idea to go ahead and reinforce all of the folds on the wall panel itself before attempting to apply any of the papers. This way we can avoid any of the bunching and creasing that might otherwise happen when attempting to apply these stiff papers around a folded structure. For the interior of the gatehouse, I'm going to be applying scrapbooking paper. This is from an old sheet that I found in my stash, and I've simply added tacky glue to one of the interior panels of the gatehouse wall, and I'm smoothing the paper directly onto the adhesive and then using a brayer to make certain that it is applied very firmly. I work from one panel to the next, reinforcing with the brayer at each juncture. Now, there's also a template included in the SVG bundle that will allow you to simply cut your scrapbooking or patterned paper to the exact dimensions of this wall. It's up to you whether you wish to hand cut, or use your maker to create your wallpaper panels. It's important to reinforce those folds before the adhesive fully cures. And now we can begin the process of adding the fourth wall, the wall that houses the door. It gets sandwiched between the two side walls of this 3-wall panel, like so. The door will be affixed to the inside of that framework. But for now, let's concentrate on getting the walls in place. I'm using a heavy-duty adhesive and then a metal ruler to help press everything together. And now we have a 4-walled structure that is lacking a top and a bottom. To supply the top and bottom, I've cut 4 rough squares of foam core board that are just shy of 3.5 inches square. And I've clamped them together and used a metal file in order to create as much uniformity between the 4 of these squares as possible, and so that they fit perfectly within the confines of the top and the bottom of the structure. I'm creating 2 gatehouses, which is why I've also created 4 of these panels. If you're only making 1 gatehouse, you only need 2. Once the glue has set up for a few minutes, now I'm going to harden the exterior of the door casing. Again, just applying super glue in a thin layer and rubbing it into the surface of the chipboard with an old gift card. This bonds everything together and hardens the substance so that this flimsy little frame becomes incredibly substantial and durable. A bead of superglue is run along the exterior edges of all of the folded corners as well. This will lock those angles into place and give the piece real durability over time. After a few moments, the superglue has hardened completely, and I smooth out the rough edges with an emery board. A black wash is applied to the interior tabs of the side panels to disguise them, and also to all of the areas that might remain exposed after we've applied our layers of paper cladding. So you see around each of the exterior corners and the window frames, the black wash has been applied. Now we can add the debossed and cut exterior panels that have been created from cardstock. These get glued directly onto the exterior walls, lining up the edges as best we can. This lattice work frame will cover each of the window apertures, and it's the base layer for the windows that will be building up over time. These exterior window frame panels get added on top of the cardstock cladding. They're mitered to fit perfectly at each of the corners and to frame that lattice work. Once the window frames are in place, it's time to harden the surface with superglue. Continue to apply each of the external cardstock cladding panels, one side at a time, until the entire exterior of your gatehouse is covered. Harden the lattice work of each of the muntins using superglue. First, I apply it in a bead around the exterior of the window, and then I use a gift card to smooth it out over the surface, working from all directions so that the entire lattice work is strengthened. I continue the hardening process over the exterior cladding panels as well. This will help to unify the surface for the treatments that are going to be added later on in the process, and of course, it will also strengthen the piece, increasing its longevity and durability. To install the door, I'm applying a good quality adhesive, in this case Fabri-Tac, onto the exposed hinge flanges. And then I'm going to simply tuck these inside of the existing door frame and press them into place, making sure that I leave enough clearance at both the top and the bottom of the door so that it will open and close naturally. Now I'll press that into place and allow the adhesive to set up before testing the functionality. After half an hour or so, the glue has dried and I'm able to activate the door without any difficulty. These sturdy little mansard roofs are created using these two sections of scored and cut lightweight chipboard. I've used the double scoring wheel for this operation, but the single scoring wheel will work as well. Fold against the score lines, creasing and reinforcing those creases with a bone folder until all of them have been folded. Once all of the score lines have been folded, you can begin assembling the mansard roof. I used Fast Grab tacky glue and it did a great job. Do the side panels first and then tuck the roof into place. I then put the piece down on a hard surface and reinforced those flaps using a bone folder. When the structure is complete and you've given it a few moments for the glue to set up, begin reinforcing all of the corners using super glue. Just as we did on the structure of the gatehouse walls, you'll want to add black paint or a wash over all of the seam lines on the roof. We'll be adding panels of very cool cardstock shingles over the top, but there's always the risk that the chipboard will show through along those exposed edges. So taking the time to coat all of the edges at this point will save headaches later on. To begin the shingling process, we're going to be layering these two opposing patterns, one on top of the other, creating strips comprised of two layers. The bottom layer will be this scalloped design, and the upper layer will be the pointed pennant design. The files have been designed so that the upper straight edge of these strips will meet exactly. So as you layer the pennant layer over the scalloped layer, keep that upper edge even, and all of these will conform. Once you've glued up all your double strips of shingles, you will be gluing them onto these guide panels. The debossing lines here act as a guide for each of the shingling strips. All the guesswork has been taken out of the process. Apply a thin amount of glue onto the surface of this roofing panel. Place one of the strips against the debossed line and press it into place. Continue this pattern until you've covered each of these guide panels. I prefer to work with uncut strips for as long as possible, lining up the scalloped and the pointed ends of each shingle layer. At the end of the process, I flip the piece over and trim away the excess. Create 4 of these panels for each of your gatehouse roofs. I found that it took a total of 5 sheets of the shingling in order to produce enough strips to cover both gatehouse roofs. Now that your shingled panels are ready to go, it's time to glue them directly to the mansard roof. This is as straightforward as you would imagine. I'm using Fabri-Tac here, but any good quality adhesive should do the job. Just cover the surface and slide each of the panels into place, doing your best to align the edges. At the end of the process, all of the lines of shingling should match up perfectly along all of the edges. These thin strips have a scored line running down the center of them, making it possible to fold them into right angles. These will be used to cover the edges of the roofing material so that we don't have those raw edges protruding. Just cut them to length and glue them into place. To provide a sturdy base to each of the mansard roofs, I'm turning to foam core once again. I'm just making an impression onto the surface of the foam using the lower edge of the roof itself. And then I'm cutting out a square that's a little bit smaller. I know that's not very precise, but the measurements here aren't as important as the functionality and the way it looks to your eye. What you're attempting to do is create a platform that holds the roof up at the correct level, most importantly so that the door can open and close, but also so that the proportions of the structure look right to you. My initial square turned out to be just slightly less than 4.5 inches on each side. This is still far too large. We want this panel to be recessed, perhaps 1/2 inch above the lower edge of the eaves. And now, before we can progress with our mansard roofs any further, we have to attend to the culprit that began all of the madness: the little railings for a widow's walk at the peak of each of the roofs. You can cut as many layers as you desire. I ended up using 2 layers of this faux wrought iron paneling cut from cardstock to create the railings for my little widow's walks. If you've watched Bentley House Minis, you'll see how beautifully this turned out, having been laser cut from a thicker material. But for our purposes, cardstock is going to work just as well. The length of these little railings is exactly perfect to fit around the upper edge of our roof, but it will require precise bending at these areas. I'm using this hand seamer that I picked up at Harbor Freight to firmly grasp the hardened cardstock between these jaws and then fold the material very firmly against the seamer. This results in a really crisp and sharp corner. You'll want to create 3 of these corners so that you have a perfect square. Once the railing has been folded into shape, use a good quality adhesive to adjoin the ends and create one for each of your roofs. Next, I'm going to add just a little bit of a decorative treatment along the bottom of the railings. Now, this is completely optional, but I liked the feeling that it gave to these funny little spindly widow's walk railings. They seemed, I don't know, just too thin and a bit awkwardly proportioned for the gatehouses until the addition of these scrap pieces of the pennant-shaped shingles. Somehow this helped to ground the design, and it was a very happy accident that the spacing on the bars of the railing and the tips of the pennants lined up precisely. Yes, I'm reaching for the copper plate gold ink once again. I want to call out the little finials at the tops of the railings, and I'm using just a micro brush and this well mixed ink to apply gold directly onto the surface of each of these finials. For an addition to the Addams family mansion, Ara Bentley created a gorgeous patina copper roof effect. I'm going to work with that same theme, but do it a little bit differently. There is no right or wrong way to approach this. I'm just experimenting and having fun, and I hope you will too. I grabbed some copper acrylic craft paint from my stash and applied it to not only the shingled areas, but also the flat top of the roof. Doing sort of a patchy coat, not worrying about it being perfect coverage. I really like the richness of the copper tone when it's applied over a black finish. Now, on her Addams family mansion, Ara used really nice square doweling to create the bases for her railings. I don't have any, and it might also be a little top heavy for this build. So I'm turning to foam core and I'm cutting thin strips, maybe 1/4 of an inch, and I'll be applying these around the base of my railings to anchor them into place and hold them securely. Once those strips of foam core have been secured, I'm coming back in with our black wash made from black acrylic craft paint diluted with do-it-yourself coffee stain, and I'm applying this rather heavily along the upper edge of the roof and along each of the seam lines at the corners, and allowing it to drip down the surface, creating an organic dripping pattern. For the next layer of the patina, I'm using turquoise acrylic craft paint, again diluted, but this time just with ordinary tap water. And then I'm loosely applying this in an almost random fashion over most of the surfaces. Once the paint has been applied, I come back in and spray it with clear water, again to encourage that organic drippiness. I simply keep dabbing this very light turquoise color all over the surface and applying the sprayed water until I get the effect that I'm looking for. The turquoise paint has a very matte finish, and it dulls down the surface considerably once it's dried. Here I'm going over everything once again with that loose black and brown wash, covering just about every bit of the surface. And once it's covered, I'm coming back in with a bit of paper toweling and wiping away some of this wash, revealing bits of both the metallic and the turquoise undercoating. Once the dark wash has been applied and selectively removed, the surface is really dull. So I'm turning to the copper paint once more and applying it in an almost dry brushing manner. I don't want to obscure the layers of grime and darkness and turquoise that we have created, but I do want to bring back some of that metallic shine. So this is definitely a layering process. It can take as few or as many layers as you're willing to create to get just the look that feels right to you. To introduce even more color variety and to hopefully attempt to replicate the look of patina in the wild, I'm now using a bright green India ink. Applying it in the same manner you've seen me do several times now, spraying it down and allowing it to pool at the tips of each of the shingles. After this first layer of bright green has had a chance to dry, I'm coming back in with 2 additional shades of India ink. One, a sort of turquoise blue, and one, a very dark green. Each of these gets spritzed down with more water and allowed to pool where it will on the surface of the shingles. While we wait for this to dry, I want to share with you an alternative method of constructing the gatehouse. This time, rather than closing up the walls, I'm adding all of the sheets of paper prior to construction. This is a different sheet of scrapbooking paper that was cut using the Cricut Maker and the provided template. It's divided into 3 sections and fits perfectly on the interior walls. There are seams at each of the folds, making it easy to bend the corners into place. A sheet of acetate has already been placed against the back of the lattice panels, and another sheet of the muntin is being placed over the acetate on the interior walls. I'm using a glue that will not fog the acetate, nor will it seep out onto the surface, and I'm smoothing everything into place with a bone folder. We'll perform the same operation on the other interior window, aligning the muntins with the existing lattice work created by the exterior panels that have been applied to the outside of the gatehouse walls. If you're going to be applying UV resin to your windows, like I do, you may want to approach your construction using this method. We'll be adding separate muntin panels onto the exterior in order to create enough depth to capture a nice layer of the UV resin. Adding this single additional muntin on the exterior provided enough depth so that when the time came to apply UV resin, it could pool up in the depressions created by the pattern. Once I had added the resin, working in small sections and in dim light, by the way, to make certain that it didn't begin to cure before I was finished, I spread out the remaining resin using a cut-off gift card. Now, be extremely careful when handling resins. I should be wearing gloves during this operation, and so should you. Nonetheless, once you've spread the resin from side to side over the lattice work, it will fill all of those little declivities, and then you can cure it. I am amazed at the difference that this very thin application of resin makes to the quality of the windows. The slight distorting effect that it creates is really just magical. And in order to hide and protect all the resin that is on the surface of that layer of muntins, you can add another layer over the top. You can leave this final layer of muntins as is, or you can grunge them up a little bit. I'm creating an extremely simple faux rust effect by adding patchy layers of a dark red, a dark brown, and finally little touches of bright orange yellow. Once these rusty little muntins have dried completely, I'm adding zig two-way glue to the back of each panel and then carefully aligning it with the existing muntins inside that recess. There's the final effect. I just love the way the glass looks. Now we can apply the window edging. I'm just putting down a layer of tacky glue around the exterior edges of the muntin panels, and then we'll slide these window frame pieces into place. At this point, you can now finish constructing the gatehouse as previously shown. If, like me, you also want there to be fences and gates with your gatehouse, you can layer up as many of these sections as you like. I used 3 layers in total for the fencing sections and 4 layers for the gates, just for extra sturdiness. Switching gears now, we're going to be working on these little brackets. We'll be making tiny lanterns that will hang from them. As you can see, they consist of 3 layers of cut chipboard. There are enough electronic die cuts in this SVG bundle to create 6 of these brackets. In addition to the brackets themselves, there are these wall plates into which the brackets are mounted, and just like the brackets, they consist of 3 layers. However, there is a top and a bottom, so pay close attention. You don't want to see a profile like this. You want this slot to line up perfectly in both directions. Once your brackets have been mounted to the wall plates, finish them in whatever way appeals to your eye. I'm going to be repeating the same color palette that was used on the door. Once the initial layers of dark red have cured, I'm adding little touches of gold ink along the exterior edges. Then I'm distressing slightly with an emery board and creating a first weathering pass using a slightly heavier blend, black acrylic craft paint, and do-it-yourself coffee stain. Now it's time to construct the lanterns. They've been cut from cardstock, and I'm using the edge of a very thin metal palette knife to help crease along all of the scoring lines. I'll do this for all 6 of the lanterns and then build them production style. After all of the creases have been reinforced on the lanterns, I'm adding the individual panes, some of which have been etched with the etching tip for the Cricut Maker to create a little star design. To glue these in place, this time I've chosen to use Zig 2-way glue. This will dry clear and create 0 squeeze out between the pane and the actual lantern framework. It's an ideal glue, in my opinion, for working with acetate and cardstock or chipboard. Once all of the panes have been glued to the framework of the lantern, it's time to begin assembling the lanterns themselves. For this, I'm using fast grab tacky glue and applying a sparing amount on each of the tabs and edges of the lantern framework. Once the glue is applied, I simply fold everything into place and hold it briefly until the adhesive has an opportunity to begin setting up. This particular glue worked extremely well for this operation. Once all the sides of the lanterns have been glued, it's a good idea to set them aside and allow them to set up for a few minutes before attempting to fold in the crown or lid. Those side seams will be under some stress as we make these final folds, so let them set up and become stronger before you attempt this final portion of the build. It's very straightforward. Just add tacky glue to the tabs and press the corners into place. A pair of tweezers can help bring the little rings at the top together so that it sets up securely. I just love the way these little lanterns turn out, and that small subtle addition of the etched star onto the panes is really cute. Switching gears yet again, now it's time to add additional finishes to the exterior of the gatehouses. I've chosen to use a very simple method of applying dry chalk pastel in a couple of earth tones and then blending out those pigments using a soft cosmetic sponge. Because of the existing texture on the cardstock exteriors, This creates a really subtle and yet lively patterning on the surface. It couldn't be simpler. Once you've added all of the tones that please your eye and you're happy with the effect, you can simply add a layer of matte medium or even matte Mod Podge right over the top in order to seal the powdered pigments. Once you're happy with the exterior of your gatehouses, it's time to finally install the mansard roofs onto the top. This is going to be extremely simple. I'm just reaching for Fabri-Tac. I'll put down a decent amount of adhesive on this upper platform and then simply place the roof on top. And because it is capped by another layer of foam core board, those two will bond together beautifully. And it's just a question of lining it up so that you have the correct amount of overhang on every side. Fabri-Tac is forgiving, and you do have several moments to make minute adjustments until you're pleased with the result. I wanted to bring the gates themselves to another level of finish, so I decided to add simple drops of UV resin over all of the portions that have been painted with the gold ink. This couldn't be simpler. But again, make sure to wear gloves or be extremely careful not to allow the UV resin to contact your skin. After adding the droplets of resin, I simply cured these with a UV light, flipped them over, and repeated the procedure on the other side. Yes, it is cilantro leaves yet again. I buy these locally at a discount store and then I grind them up to a very fine powder using a crafting only coffee grinder. That results in this substance right here, which I'm going to mix in specific ratios to create a permanent and easy to work with moss paste. I'll mix 1 tablespoon of the pulverized cilantro leaves together with 1 tablespoon of plain PVA. This is Elmer's Glue All. Finally, to add permanent color to the mixture and also to thin the consistency just slightly, I'll be adding a few drops of this Bombay India ink in grass green. It's a very vivid green. I'll dispense a few drops of it using a plastic pipette. After drawing a small amount of ink into the pipette, I dispense 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drops into the mixture. The mixture is then stirred thoroughly using a palette knife. And now it's ready to apply. It's as simple as spreading it on and scraping across the surface with your palette knife. Once this mixture dries, it will be extremely durable and permanent. Plus, it has just the right scale of texture for 1/12 scale moss. I just love that. I recommend mixing up this moss paste in small batches. When left in the open air, it dries out extremely quickly. But it's really easy to work with. As you can see here, it is gliding onto the surface of these shingles very, very easily. I think that's just a beautiful effect. So, make up your new and improved moss texture paste and use it anywhere that your creations could use a little more soul. Another benefit to this paste is that it doesn't require sealing at all, and it will only strengthen anything that you apply it to. Once you've had your fun adding moss to all of the surfaces, it's time to install the brackets for the lanterns. Now remember, there were 6 of these. There are 2 intended for each of the gatehouses, and then 2 that will hang on the gateposts for the main gate entrance. To create those gateposts, I'm reaching for a scrap of foamular and my styro cutter. It's not the most elegant tool in the world, nor the most precise, but this will go to show you that even when you're just bootstrapping, not measuring, and not being terribly careful at all, you can create some effects that are really pretty cool. I was in a huge rush to get this project completed, and so this aspect, creating the gateposts, was something that I was just hurrying through. But nonetheless, I'm really pleased with how they turned out, and I think that if you also allow yourself to play and not be quite so concerned about measuring, you may surprise yourself and really enjoy the results. Even though these are still pink, I love the way they look with the sections of wrought iron fencing. So let's take care of that pink problem. I just applied a very loose coat of a medium brown acrylic craft paint onto everything. And then, turning to foam core board yet again, I created a completely eyeballed series of squares to serve as the bases and capstones for each of the fences, and I just beveled them using a metal file. Yep, nothing fancy here. Once all of these wonky but beveled squares had been created, I glued them together in layers for the bases, impaled a toothpick into the rough center, and applied a little bit of Fabri-Tac between the 2 surfaces, and pressed everything into place. Like I said, it's not fancy, but it's certainly functional. And once all of the finishes have been applied, it looks really good, at least to my eye. Of course, I'm biased. To finish off these gateposts, I'm just skewering these 1-inch styrofoam spheres onto the very top. Again, being pretty haphazard with my placement, but being very careful to glue them firmly in place. A hasty and extremely sloppy, almost dry brushing of sort of a cream color over everything that's been base coated with the brown helps to unify all of these surfaces. Of course, once we add our fabulous moss paste, these pieces are going to look fantastic. The next task is to install the brackets from which the lanterns will hang, one on either of these larger fence posts. To impart just a little bit more stateliness to the front gates, I'm adding these Tim Holtz hitch fasteners to this central circular area. They happen to just fit perfectly, and they're super simple to install. There. Necessity is the mother of invention, and I needed to invent some hinges for these gates post-haste. So I reached for these black coffee stirrers, and I trimmed them down to 3 inches long. And I grabbed some wire from my stash. This happens to be the kind of wire used to tie off grids of rebar when pouring concrete. Yeah, I know, it's weird, but I really like this wire. It's very cheap. I get it at Home Depot, and it's extremely useful in a lot of different situations. So I'm just snipping off these rounded ends, and I'll be inserting these wires through the sections of stir straws. Before inserting the wire, I'm creating a roughly 90-degree bend at one end, and then once the wire has been inserted through the straw, I'm trying to match that same angle and plane with another 90-ish degree bend at the other end. So how to attach this to our gate without looking too bulky? I know, UV resin. Why the heck not? So I gave it a shot, and you know what? It worked. So I lay out the pieces on a ceramic tile, which won't be damaged by the resin. And then I placed a bead of the resin between the edge of the gate and the stir straw. Then it's just a question of curing the resin by using a UV flashlight. And voila, we have a working hinge that doesn't add a great deal of bulk and is perfectly stylistically in keeping with the faux wrought iron fencing. And it's super functional when you're working with foam like I am, because you can simply press the prongs of the wire directly into the foam. Yep, it's a pretty elegant solution, and I'm actually really proud of it. I love this hinging system, and I know I'll be using it in the future. To attach the permanent gate sections to the fence posts, I'm using little staple-shaped or U-shaped segments of that same wire. I've just bent them using my needle nose pliers, and now I'm inserting them into the foam, capturing the outer edge of the fence section. One at the top and one at the bottom, and the fence is secure. After a quick weathering pass with that same watery black mixture we've been using throughout the project, I'm adding in a new batch of our wonderful faux moss paste. I just love this stuff. It gets added onto all of the pillars in order to blend everything together. And of course, I couldn't resist adding the moss paste also to the little lanterns. This will serve a couple of purposes. Of course, it will help to age them and unify them with the rest of the elements in the scene, but I'm also using it to disguise some of the corners where the paper has left a little bit of a gap. So it's going to decorate, strengthen, and hide some crimes all at the same time. I'd say that's pretty useful stuff. Well, Ara, I hope that you are proud of yourself, my friend. You started me on a long and winding road that arrives here and now, and I couldn't be happier. Thank you so much for all the inspiration, encouragement, and support that you offer the creative community. It just wouldn't be the same without you, and I look forward to following your journey for decades to come, my friend. I hope that following along with this build has given you some inspiration and hopefully some practical ideas to help in your own work. As always, thank you for hanging out with me today. Until next time, bye.